I'm Lillian, welcome back to my channel Ink & Pages. Today I'm going to be talking through some of the books I read during spring. This wrap up is going to be split over 2 videos just as a result of my own pessimism. I didn't think I'd read enough books that they'd require multiple videos to talk about, but I've actually read at least 15, so can't talk about them all at once. And actually the very first book I have to talk about, I didn't even read in spring, I read it in January. But I didn't talk about it in my winter wrap up, apart from to mention that I'd read it because it was my Boardroom pick for January and that vlog wasn't out yet. It is now, so I'll talk about it more now, and it is When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain by Nhi Vo. This is the second book in the Singing Hills cycle novella series, I think it's called, and I actually enjoyed this one even more than the first book, The Empress of Salt and Fortune. This has the exact same structure as the first book in that it follows a cleric called Chi as they travel around and listen to and record stories and history. And in this book they hear about a story of a particular tiger. Whereas the first book felt very gentle and interesting and slowly unwinding, this one felt a bit more intense and high stakes even because of the tiger. It felt a bit more like a fairy tale or some sort of magical story than straight history, which I think is what The Empress of Salt and Fortune felt more like. I also really enjoyed this book's discussion of storytelling as a medium and how there's no one true version of a story and how the story can change depending on who is telling it and also who they're telling it to. And I really enjoyed this book. I've given it 4 stars and I would read 100 more stories like this with the same exact structure where we follow Chi and we hear the stories that they hear. And I'll also add that I really liked the characterization of the tigers themselves and how, yes, brutal and bloodthirsty and dangerous they can be, but also the customs and norms of their society as well. I thought that was really interesting to read about. The next book I have was my February Buzzwordathon pick, and it is I Am Not Your Baby Mother by Candice Brathwaite. This is half non-fiction and half a mini memoir. It has a lot of her own experiences in, which I really enjoyed. But this is about Black British motherhood and how the reality of that experience is so vastly different to the stereotypes portrayed in the British media. I really liked the writing in this. I loved how it felt so open and honest and conversational. I think this struck a really good balance between talking about her own experiences and then talking about, Black British motherhood in general, with maybe particular emphasis on families of Caribbean heritage like hers. And she writes a couple of times in here oh, but this isn't my memoir, or this isn't my autobiography. And I was reading those thinking, I kind of wish it was. I would really like to read a full-on proper autobiography from her. I think it would be so interesting. She wrote this book as, she says it's the book she wished she had been given when she first found out she was pregnant, because there's not a lot of representation of Black British mothers in, the motherhood blogging sphere and stuff like that. And it was her aim to increase that representation by writing this book. The last chapter of this book did lose me a little bit just because it talks more about her social media career, and that's a subject I'm not very interested in. But I would still really recommend this book to anyone, even if like me you're obviously not a Black British mother. Whether you plan to have kids or not, I think you could get a lot out of this. Next we have the first book I reread in 2022, and what a choice, can I just say. It was A Dark Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. I fucking love this book. I loved it this time. I think this is the 3rd time I've read it. Technically only I have knocked it down from a 5-star to a 4.5, but that is still fucking good. It is just as good as I remember it being, except that I had forgotten quite a lot of the details, which meant that it was fun to reread them and rediscover exactly why I loved it that much. This book series follows Kel, who is a magician, and he lives in a different version of London. And there are 4 different versions of London. There's Grey London, which is our real London in the Regency era. There's Red London, which is where Kel is from, which is very lively and full of magic. It just sounds so cool. It's so bad I want to go there. There's White London, which is sort of decaying from the magic it holds, and then Black London, which has been, out of service for years. Apparently it's been destroyed by magic. No one goes there, no one knows exactly what happened. And Kel is unique because he is one of the only people who can travel between parallel Londons, and he is kind of like a messenger, but also a smuggler on the down low, which is illegal and you shouldn't be doing that, and it's great. Kel is such a fun protagonist. He's a bit angsty, but he's good-hearted and it's a fun combo. And the other main character in this, Lila, I was a bit worried that upon this reread she would be a bit too much like I'm not like other girls. And I mean, she was like that a little bit, but it wasn't as bad as I was worried about. She was very fun and occasionally said something a bit annoying, but was mostly actually a very sympathetic character. I absolutely love hearing about the different worlds and seeing them. I forgot how much I liked White London. Like, that surprised me this time around. I mean, Red London is my favourite, don't get me wrong, but White London is so cool and interesting as well. I think the structure of this works so well. It's not a slow burn, it's not a slow plot, but it's a slow crescendo to a big dramatic ending is what I'd say. And there were certain elements like plot points and characters that I remembered really fondly and wanted to get to that actually I realised aren't properly introduced and don't probably happen till tantalisingly close to the end. The writing is great, the twists I had mostly forgotten about, so really enjoyed them again. And yeah, even though this is technically, but only technically, decreased in rating, if anything, this reread has fully cemented this as an all-time favourite series of mine. Because I think it's actually slightly easier to get 5 stars the first time I read a book than to get 4.5 the third time I read it. So yeah, an absolute favourite, gorgeous, probably my favourite book of the year so far, like, let's not lie. But actually, next, I have a bit of a funny book, which got the same rating actually. It got 4.5 stars from me, and it is a piece of Harry Potter fan fiction called Ignite, written by a user called Slide, whose real identity we'll maybe never know. First of all, let's have a moment of silence for harrypotterfanfiction.com, which went down without me realising. I was really worried all my favourite stories would be lost forever, including this one, because I fucking love this book and this is also a reread. I think this is the 3rd time I've read it. And let me just say now, this book, this piece of incredible fanfiction is the worthy successor to the sentimental version of Harry Potter I hold in my head, and not, you know, what it actually is and what J.K. Rowling is trying to do to it. This is the worthy follow-up. This is about the next generation, so it's about Albus and Scorpius and Rose mostly, and it's set at Hogwarts, I think in their 6th year, and there is this magical plague. This was written like well before Cursed Child came out, so none of the characters or anything like they appear to be in that, mostly for the better. And we get some great original characters. Can I get a cheer for Methuselah Jones? Yes, please. Normally I would not count fanfiction in my wrap-ups, but this is excellent, and it's almost 200,000 words long, making it the equivalent of like a 600-page book, so you know I'm counting this. It is so exciting and emotional. It is quite possibly the best fanfiction I've ever read in a purely objective and also subjective, because I love it, way. The only downside I can think is that sometimes they spend too much time talking about their feelings instead of getting on with the action. But like, that's hardly a big disadvantage. It's incredible. I loved it. It's the first in a trilogy. I've never read the 3rd one. I didn't want it to end. I've read this one. This is the 3rd time, I think. And I've read the 2nd one, I think, once and a half. The 2nd one I remember being very long in a way that it shouldn't have been. But this one, Ignite, it's pretty much the perfect Harry Potter fanfiction. It's the perfect continuation to the series. And one final thing, it does a great job of introducing the new characters and the new generation and making them all feel fleshed out and real, and so I love them so much. While also some of the original characters do make appearances and they feel so in character. I think it's actually great. Okay, I've talked about it enough. It's amazing, you should read it. The next book I read was Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. This is, I don't want to call it a Rumpelstiltskin retelling. I think that's disingenuous. I would say it's inspired by Rumpelstiltskin in some ways, but it's really more like you're reading it and every now and then you go, oh, that kind of reminds me of Rumpelstiltskin, and then you move on. Like, it's really, it's not a retelling, but this still felt like a fairy tale, and I liked how it very slowly unspooled the plot in a way that you couldn't really anticipate what was going to happen next. Kind of like the first time you read a fairy tale, you don't really know where it's going. This has multiple POVs and it does switch between them, and it doesn't always say the name of the person it's switching to, but it's very clever in that the style of writing is different kind of for each person. So for the more educated characters, it's quite eloquent and there are fancy words used, and you can tell you are reading from an educated character's perspective, whereas the other ones, it's more simple language, it can be childish at times. So I think it really works to distinguish the characters from each other. This book actually has so many characters whose perspectives we read from that the blurbs mention different ones. So this copy I have, it mentions Miriam and Irina on the back cover as if they were the two main characters. And I do think Miriam is probably the majorist character, but if you're going to mention Irina in your blurb, you should also mention Wanda, and then what's to stop you mentioning the other three characters whose perspectives we read from? And because we have so many characters, it is kind of hard to say exactly what this story is about in a nice succinct way. So I appreciate the struggle of having to write a blurb for it. But I would say probably Miriam is the main character, and she is a Jewish girl whose dad is a moneylender, and they live in this country called Litvas, which I'm thinking of as like Lithuania because the author is from Jewish Lithuanian heritage. I read this in like March, April, and I was worried I was reading it at the wrong time of year. I thought it was a very wintry book and that reading it in spring I wouldn't be able to appreciate it as much, but actually this book is about a very cold spring and it's about winter like impeaching on spring. So actually I accidentally read it at the perfect time. The writing of this book is very detailed and precise, which I appreciated. But the plot is very, very slow. It's very slow. There's no point mincing words. It's very slow. I took a couple of breaks from reading this just because it was so slow paced, and it really wasn't what I was expecting in a lot of ways. I liked how it talked about morality, and it kind of examines the fact that no one is 100% good, no one is 100% evil. I thought that was very interesting. But I did like it, and I'm giving it a solid 3 stars. Next, I read Galatea by Madeleine Miller. This I mistakenly thought was like a new release of hers, and in my April TBR I was not very kind about it because it just seemed like such a cash grab, because it's a tiny short story. I think it's like 30 pages long, and Waterstones was selling it for like £13, I think. Absolutely ridiculous. The cynic in me still does not like that. Turns out it's not a new release. It's one she wrote quite a while ago and they're like republishing it for money, for a cash grab. And let me tell you, this book is not worth £13. This book is not worth the paper it was printed on. It was not good. Well, it was 2 stars. So it was baseline okay, and that is the most I can say about it. It was just kind of pointless and boring. It had quite an interesting idea. It's about the guy who sculpts a beautiful woman out of marble or whatever, and then she comes to life, and like that's her, that's the main character. And it was fine. I went in with very low expectations, so maybe it was just a self-fulfilling prophecy, but I feel like 30 pages of this just did nothing. It should have been either a full-length novel, or it should have been the first story in an anthology of Greek mythology retellings. I really think it would have worked well in that context. On its own, it was boring. It took me like 20 minutes to read, and at the end I was like, that was a waste of 20 minutes. Anyway, the next book I read was The Mad Woman's Ball by Victoria Mass. Unfortunately, also another disappointment. I gave this 2.5 stars just because I think I was missing something. Whereas in Galatea, I don't think there was much to be missed. In this, I really finished it and I was like, huh? I feel like I missed something. This is a historical fiction book set in 1800s Paris about this famous asylum for mad women, except mostly, you know, it's used just for the women that society doesn't want. They just get shoved in there instead. This book follows 2 women, firstly a nurse who's worked at the asylum for like 20 years, I think, and also a young woman called Eugenie, and their paths will cross. And it was okay with some interesting bits, hence the 2.5 rating. But at the end, I felt like it was trying to make a point. It was trying to say something. And I think what it said, I did not like. Because this talks a lot about sexism and historical sexism and the asylum and this idea of hysterical women and mentally ill women and who should be there and who needs help and who has just sort of been imprisoned there by their families. And I feel like at the end, lots of things happen and it comes to a head, and I read it and I was like, that is not the conclusion I would have gone with. That's not the point I would have made, because I so strongly disagree with it. I was like, what? I feel like you can't seriously be telling me this and expecting me to understand, expecting me to nod and be like, yeah, you've got a good point. It was just a very weird version of a happy ending, where I was reading it and going, how is this a happy ending? How are you presenting this to me like it's the best possible outcome? It was very weird. But I'm ending this wrap up on a positive note because the next two books I really liked. Firstly is Disability Visibility, edited by Alice Wong. This is a collection of a load of different pieces of writing, all by disabled authors. And I heard so many people saying, oh, it's amazing, it's life-changing. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, we'll go in. And you know what? It is amazing because it includes so many different people and so many different pieces of writing. It is so interesting. I did not know practically anything about disability justice. Now I feel like I've barely scratched the surface, but what this has done is introduced me to a lot of different concepts and topics that I now want to go and read more about. Not every single one of the pieces in here obviously could be equally impactful on me and I enjoyed as much as the rest of them, but I love that there were so many of them and so many different authors were included, and actually quite a few of them I'd already heard of and I wanted to read their book or their pieces of writing anyway, and then finding them in here was so exciting because it was like, yeah, I definitely now want to read more from you. So yeah, I would highly recommend this. It feels weird to be giving it a rating, but I think I'm going to give it, 4 stars because it was very good. And I think no matter who you are going to find at least some of this interesting and compelling and powerful because the stories and the experiences in here are just so varied. Okay, and the last book I have to talk about in this wrap up is A Gathering of Shadows by V.E. Schwab. Obviously the sequel to A Darker Shade of Magic. This was also a reread. I've read the 2 books in the trilogy before, and this one again held up just as much as the first time. Again, I'm giving it a 4.5. This book brings us back to Red London, all the characters we know and love from the first book, and is kind of centered around this magical competition, kind of like, the Magical Olympics in terms of scale and prestige. And I just really feel like this series and these characters and this world were created specifically for me to love. This series, sets my brain on fire and I love it. Again, it has that perfectly sweet, slow crescendo to an even more dramatic and explosive ending than the first one. It just slowly gets more and more intense until you're at the end and you're like, Jesus Christ, you can't end the book like that, and then she does. Again, I remembered the overarching things, and I remembered that there was this crazy killer cliffhanger at the end, but I'd forgotten quite a lot of the details. So again, it was really fun to re-experience those things and just fall in love with it again. I just want to go to Red London. That's what I've learned. That's what I've learned from reading this. I loved it so much, did I mention? So now that I've finished this, I have the 3rd and final book in the trilogy to read. And so my mission for this year was to reread these first 2 books, which I've done, check, and is to then read the 3rd book and finally finish the series. So that's next. But honestly, it's amazing, outstanding, one of my favorite series of all time. Just fucking love it. So that's it for this first batch of my spring reads. Let me know if you have read any of these or what your favorite thing you read between March and mid-April was. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you in my next one.